And now it's time to investigate the fungus among us. Welcome to Chapter 12 from the Tortura text. The technical term for the study of fungi is mycology. And mycologists who study fungi have noted so many unique characteristics of fungi that they've been given their own separate kingdom amongst all the life forms, various life forms that are out there. And nutritionally, all fungi have the same classification, referred to as chemoheterotrophic. A chemoheterotroph means that the chemicals that they obtain for their food comes from other sources. Hetero refers to other, and then troph means to feed. So they don't make their own food like an autotroph, such as a plant. And fungi are often multicellular. At the microscopic level, these would be referred to as molds. So we have multicellular molds. If we see microscopic fungi that are unicellular, these would be the yeasts. And we'll skip over mushrooms since they're not really part of microbiology as a subject, just due to their size. And then we can look at cellular arrangement. All sorts of fungi produce what are called hyphae. And hyphae are described as filamentous structures. They look like little threads or filaments that are clear, and they tangle up into masses called mycelia. So hyphae give rise to mycelia, or the singular for one mass of hyphae is called mycelium. And the way that all fungi get their food is through an absorptive mode. They don't have moving body parts or a mouth or teeth or anything that they can use to mechanically chew up their food. Chemically, they will secrete enzymes extracellularly that then will break down potential food and make it small enough to draw in to the fungal organism. And finally, when it comes to some of the other characteristic features that we should take a look at, we can observe the various spores that fungi produce. And the spores come in two major varieties. We have sexual spores and asexual spores. And not all species can make sexual spores. Asexual spores are a lot more common, regardless of whether or not an organism has the ability to produce both types. And we can use the different spore types for classifying and identifying these organisms. Sexual spores are typically used in the classification of organisms that are fungal. We look at the anatomical structures that make sexual spores, and we can then put them into certain classes. When it comes to identification, which is to take a sample of fungi and figure out a way to figure out which organism it is to identify it, we most often will look at the asexual spores that are much more prevalent in the environment and can be put under the microscope readily then, and along with their arrangement of their hyphae, you can most often then get a good look at what they look like and be able to identify them. Here's a table taken from our book that compares some of the major characteristics of fungi when compared to the bacteria that we've learned so much about. When comparing the fungi, we can look at the fact that fungi are much more like plants and animals, and that they're eukaryotic. They have nuclei. Whereas we know bacteria lack a nuclear membrane or nucleated cells. And cell membranes in fungi contain sterols. Animals have the sterol called cholesterol, but fungi actually have a unique type of sterol called ergosterol. Whereas bacteria typically lack sterols, except for Mycoplasma, which is a parasitic bacterium to humans. Apparently Mycoplasma does have cholesterol, but the vast majority of bacteria have what are called hopanoids, which are basically not a sterol technically. Fungi have cell walls, and the cell walls, you may recall, contain the chemical chitin. And listed here as well are the glucans and mannans, which happen to be other carbohydrates that I'll just not spend as much time on, but they are present in the fungal cell wall. Bacteria, we know, have peptidoglycan if they have a cell wall, which most do. And fungi do produce spores, both sexual and asexual, and we can look at the specific names of spores and how they're made. But when we look at bacteria, so far we've talked about endospores in bacteria during the endospore stain, and those are not reproductive structures. So bacteria have different spores, and so anyway, comparing the two, very different. Fungi, metabolically, are heterotrophic, as mentioned in the previous slide, and they either require oxygen or can do without oxygen in some cases, depends on the species. And when compared to bacteria, bacteria can have all of those characteristics depending on the wide world of variety that's out there for bacterial life. And bacteria also can be autotrophic, and so some of them are photosynthetic or can get their chemicals by making most of their own food or nutrients. And when we compare that to fungi, fungi are not this way. They must get their nutrients from other places. The kingdom fungi has many members. It's estimated that there may be more than 100,000 different species divided into macroscopic fungi on one group, and then the other major group comprised of the microscopic molds and yeasts. Pictured on the right is one of the single largest mushrooms ever discovered as a single growth, and it reportedly weighed over 60 pounds and was found in Chiapas, Mexico. However, even more fascinating perhaps is the fact that some people estimate in Oregon that a mushroom growth that has mycelia growing underneath over 2 football fields worth of acreage. There are mycelia that are popping up mushrooms that are all genetically identical, and the estimated biomass of that particular fungal structure, if you consider it to be a single organism, weighs more than the largest single life form by comparison, say the blue whale. And so fungi can be a fascinating group of organisms to study. But that's as much as we'll say about mushrooms for this topic. We'll focus in on the microscopic molds and yeasts from here on out. Fungi are all said to be heterotrophic, as we know, and the majority are nature's recyclers. A technical term for these organisms are that they are saprobic, or that they are saprobes, which are microorganisms that live from the remains of dead plant or animal material or decaying materials. And there are a few that are parasitic, even though the majority are not. And the parasites then have to make their living, or I should say they can make their living off of the tissues then of living organisms like a human or an animal or plant. And these diseases that come from parasitic fungi are called mycoses, and so a medical term for fungal infection. And their typical preference for growth is between room temperature, about 20 degrees Celsius, on up through 40 degrees, which is just a few degrees warmer than human body temperature, which is 37 degrees. And we could say that You can't get away from fungi. They're ubiquitous, which means extremely widespread. Every place you look in the environment, there's a chance that you could find these fungi. So we say ubiquitous. And so sampling them, we'll look at techniques like tape mounts, where you can take some sticky tape wherever you think there could be mold growth or some presence of fungi, and we can put them under the microscope and see whether they're present. We can take samples of mold spores or air samples and look to see if there are mold spores and grow the fungi from those samples. And we'll find that molds are in a lot of places that we didn't suspect. Fungi are so prevalent in our environment that we can say that they're not only in the air and dust, but that they're all over what we call fomites, which is a technical medical term for inanimate objects that can carry germs and possibly transfer them. So any common use items, fill in the blank in your minds. A fomite could be a keyboard or a telephone or a door handle, handrail, etc. And we can say that fungi even occupy our normal flora, which are amongst our with the bacteria and any microorganisms that occupy space in or on our bodies. So fungi are part of that population. And humans are considered to be relatively resistant to fungal infection. For the most part, we don't suffer from fungal infections that often, but this is different for plants. So fungi are relatively non-pathogenic to animals. But by comparison, one of the most common plant pathogens are fungi. Plants work differently. Animals, so I just want to specify, animals have an active immune system with white blood cells that can very readily attack fungi, and generally will be able to eliminate them with great efficiency so that we don't notice our exposure to potential fungal pathogens. Plants, on the other hand, are very susceptible. When you think about produce or what farmers have to go through to produce food and keep it safe and free from mold invasion. There are only about, 300 species, it says here, out of the roughly 100,000 that can cause infection in animals. And so mycoses in general are classified by their level of invasiveness or potential invasiveness. And so we can say that there are true fungal pathogens, which are going to be fungi that even a healthy, non-immunocompromised person could become infected. However, not every human is at peak strength, and many people who are hospitalized or are suffering from some other underlying predisposing condition could end up with a fungal infection due to what are called opportunistic pathogens. And so fungi are really classified for the most part as pathogens of unique opportunity. When a person's immune system is failing, they're called immunocompromised. We'll see that a common theme with studying mycoses is that these fungal pathogens take advantage of people who are in a weakened state. Here's a table taken from another textbook, but I decided to throw it into our presentation because it really is a comprehensive list of everything that we're going to see in this presentation when it comes to fungal pathogens. And these fungal pathogens are divided into three major categories as they're presented. The first category, the so-called true primary pathogens, includes Histoplasma capsulatum, Blastomycosis dermatitidis, Coccidioides immitis. We will skip over Paracoccidioides brasiliensis. We'll also look then at a second group of pathogens which are intermediate in their ability to cause disease in healthy humans. They're called Sporotrichosis, and then the dermatophytes, which are like ringworm, if you've ever heard of ringworm, or things like athlete's foot, and they're caused by Microsporum, Trichophyton, and Epidermophyton genuses. And then thirdly, we have the last group, which are the secondary opportunistic pathogens. And so the secondary, down here, the secondary opportunistic pathogens includes major categories like Candida, Aspergillus, Cryptococcus, and Pneumocystis. We will skip over the Mucorales species and just focus on all these other ones that have a star by them. So this will be good to look back at. Just gives you some of the major facts and the names of the diseases and the organisms that will be covered. True pathogens, also called primary fungal pathogens, are amongst the most dangerous of all the fungal species. And thankfully, there aren't a large number of species that fall into this category, but they're considered most dangerous because even a healthy person can become infected and possibly suffer symptoms from exposure to these so-called true pathogens. And one of the major characteristics of these true pathogens is their ability to change form. We call that a dimorphism, di meaning two, and then morph is referring to shape or form, based on a thermal difference, which is going to be differences in temperature. So 30 degrees, or I would say really room temperature, which is more down towards 20 degrees, and then on up through about 30 degrees, we see that the organisms typically grow as molds. So we can say molds at room or environmental temperatures. And then when they get inside the human body or an animal, there's going to be a body warmth. And 37 degrees is human body temperature. And this is then elevated enough to where these molds will change their form fairly quickly to becoming yeasts. And once they become yeasts, they look different under the microscope because they take on this unicellular existence, but they can grow and multiply and start to invade the organs of the host. And in some cases, they can disseminate from maybe the lungs, where they're typically inhaled during primary exposure, and then they can secondarily get into or disseminate into many different organs in the body, especially in people who have a weakened immune system. But even healthy people can suffer from these true pathogens. So this changing of shape is a striking adaptation for sure, and it's uncommon. It's not something that we typically observe in fungi in general. So when we see this in a fungal organism, we suspect that maybe that's a sign that it's a pathogen. Thermal dimorphism can be observed readily in the lab as well. All we need to do is take one of these organisms that falls into this category, and if you put the organism into the incubator at 37 degrees, they'll grow looking like large bacterial colonies, but they're actually yeast colonies. And then if you were to take these organisms and take a sample and put them into a petri plate or a tube and then grow them at room temperature, which would be closer to the 20 degree Celsius mark, we'll see that that same exact organism will grow possibly in fuzzy or cottony looking structures, which then can produce spores, and these can become airborne. And if they get back into an animal, you can see how this cycle can go round and round, and this is how the disease gets into the host and then changes form. Pathogenesis is the disease-causing process, and fungi can bring about disease in different ways. But we can talk about gen being giving birth to, and then patho is referring to disease. So we'll say here disease process for pathogenesis. And the first prerequisite for disease is how the fungi get in. So we can talk about the portal of entry. Where do the organisms enter the body? So there are a group of organisms, primary mycoses they're called, which typically are inhaled, as described in the previous slide, from the environment, and then the organism may change from a mold spore into a yeast. And then there's another portal of entry, which is less common, but sometimes occurs, where a subcutaneous type of fungal pathogen will get in underneath the skin, maybe through like a cut or some sort of wound, and then the molds will germinate into, well, basically change form once again into yeast-like organisms. And then finally, one of the most common portals of entry are cutaneous and superficial types of fungal infection, where the skin, just underneath the skin or on the surface of the skin, we see that sometimes molds or fungi can overgrow. So these are the three portals of entry that can start off the disease process. And once the fungi get into these portals of entry, various disease-causing factors called virulence factors will be expressed or produced by the fungi so that they can start the disease process. Virulence means disease-causing ability. And we can look at these various virulence factors. Thermal dimorphism, which was mentioned as one such example, but then we can also look at toxin production. So there are various secretory toxins that can cause tissues to start to break down and for organs of the host to malfunction, and then the fungi can take advantage of these compromised tissues. Also, capsules, which we talk about in bacteria mostly, can also be present on yeasts, which are some unicellular fungal pathogens, and also adhesion factors are basically ways in which fungi can stick to various tissues. And then keratinase, this is, if you're familiar with the names of enzymes, ends in ASE, and keratin is a protein that helps to keep your hair and your skin and fingernails strong. So this enzyme breaks down these surface tissues. And then you're talking about like cutaneous fungal pathogens that can invade further and cause a lot of damage using the enzymes called keratinases. How about we just put enzymes that digest keratin? When we consider the human or animal as a potential host for fungal infection, and we mentioned previously that fungi are not typically pathogenic, it's due to the fact that we have defense mechanisms that are strong enough to ward off most would-be fungal pathogens, and they come in the form of our skin being a good barrier, so long as it's not opened up or scratched. And then we can talk about respiratory cilia. So within the mucous membranes, there are these cilia that help to keep the mucus moving along. And secondly, within these areas underneath the skin or inside the lungs or the other mucous membrane environments, you have cell-mediated immunity. Even inside the blood and other tissues, you get these phagocytes that can wander around and patrol and eliminate fungi that get into places where we definitely want to eliminate them so that they cannot start to produce inflammation and ultimately infection. And unfortunately, although these defense mechanisms are powerful and keep us protected maybe throughout our lives, we do not have any vaccines or mechanisms for long-term immunity at this time. And we can debate as to why this is true, but generally fungi are a lot more similar to humans, and vaccines usually exploit differences or train our bodies to defend against pathogens that are a lot different than we are, like bacteria and viruses. And so we do not see, even when people suffer from a given fungal infection, that they then are immunized against that, like in the case of memory cells. And that's what we know to be true about fungal infection and fighting it, is that you can suffer from the same kind of fungal pathogen repeatedly without there being a good, sufficient long-term immunity. The control of mycotic infections, or mycoses, has not relied on immunization thus far. We can only hope that in the near future or someday that maybe there'll be some vaccines. There is one undergoing intense research right now that's showing some promise with preventing Candida, which is the causative agent of the common yeast infection. But at the moment, we still have no vaccines that are FDA approved. So we rely on medications. Antifungal medications like amphotericin or flucytosine, various azoles, nystatins, these drugs all have one major mode of action, which is that they inhibit the ergosterol, which is unique in the cell membranes of fungi. So we see that ergosterol inhibition of some sort is how these drugs work. Either they inhibit the production of ergosterol, or if ergosterol is made, then some of these drugs are able to inhibit the deposition of the ergosterol into the growing fungal pathogen cell membrane. Now, if the damage gets far enough, or in addition to using antifungal drugs, in some cases it's necessary to use plastic surgery or other types of surgical intervention when a person has a lot of damaged tissue, subcutaneous types of infections, or perhaps really severe disseminated infections sometimes require surgery. And lastly, prevention of, say catching mycoses has to do with just trying to remove the risks for exposure. So personal protective equipment, masks and clothing and such, in environments where there may be a hazard to becoming exposed or inhaling fungal pathogens, then this would be the sensibility, and the measures that would be taken is to try to put some sort of physical blockage between you and that fungal pathogen, depending on the type of career. Construction workers sometimes find themselves having to guard against exposure to too many mold spores after water damage in buildings that have been damaged due to flooding. The remainder of this chapter will be spent looking at the various fungal diseases, or mycoses, and they can be subcategorized into 5 different major levels of infection. We can start with some of the most serious infections, which are classified as systemic. We can define a systemic fungal infection as deep in the body, and infections that are considered systemic are usually fungal infections in the blood and or the lungs, or disseminated disease, which is another way of saying multi-organ involvement. Secondly, we have subcutaneous types of infection. A subcutaneous infection basically means below the skin. So we could classify this as subdermal, a deep tissue infection, and then a third type of infections are called cutaneous infections. Cutaneous mycoses are classified as fungi that infect the dermis or dermal layer, of the skin and the living epidermis. The epidermis is the outermost layer of our skin surface, but the outermost layer of the epidermis, the upper layer, is dead tissue. And then you have the part of the epidermis that is innervated with nerves and consists of healthy living skin tissue underneath the surface of dead cells at the uppermost epidermis. And speaking of the uppermost part of the epidermis, fungi can still take advantage of this environment and colonize and sometimes irritate the skin or digest the surface dead skin. And these are called superficial types of mycoses. So they can be defined as invading the surface skin or the hair. Most of our hair is dead other than the root structure that grows the hair, and yet some fungi can invade the hair shaft or attack this part of the body. And then finally we have opportunistic infections. And keep in mind that an opportunistic infection could actually invade these other parts of the body. So some opportunistic infections can become systemic or could be involved in a subcutaneous, cutaneous, or even superficial sort of level of infection. But we say that any opportunistic pathogen is one that takes advantage of anyone who it would be described as immunocompromised as a category. Immuno referring to the immune system, and then compromised because one or more underlying problems have occurred in a person who is immunocompromised. And so we'll look during this section at what defines various types of immunocompromised patients, and in that way you'll understand the risks for why certain fungi are major opportunistic pathogens. From the list on the previous slide, let's start with systemic mycoses. Histoplasmosis, also referred to as Ohio Valley fever, where it has high prevalence, is caused by a fungal pathogen, Histoplasma capsulatum, and it is the most common of the true fungal pathogens, and histoplasmosis is found in other places around the world, but in any case, it's a dimorphic organism that can take on both mold forms out in the environment and then yeast forms as spores from the mold are inhaled into the lungs. And we see this infection distributed in, not here in California, but in the eastern and central regions of the United States, and then in other countries in the world. And I'll show a map in a couple slides that'll give you the distribution. And we can say that where histoplasmosis occurs, there's typically a high nitrogen content in soil with enough moisture to grow mold. And so researchers would wonder, or have wondered, why is there a high nitrogen content? And the high nitrogen content has been most often associated with bird droppings. So birds will make a mess around some area in the environment, and their waste has a lot of nitrogen. And then this will get into the soil, and if the soil has enough moisture, it'll start to grow mold, which then will produce spores. And the spores, during a drier part of the season in the environment following that, can become airborne. Maybe this is during construction or following some disturbance in the Earth's crust, or something causes these spores to become airborne. Maybe just high winds, like in valley areas like Ohio Valley. And what can happen then is that the spores get inhaled into the lungs. And so even healthy people who are just out for some exercise, or maybe they're involved in some sort of work outdoors, and they can become exposed to these spores, and then the spores will germinate inside the lungs and cause scar tissue to form. And this is the body's defense to build a wall around these yeasts that start to grow from histoplasma inhalation. And in most cases, this is the end of the story. Most cases stop here. The person may end up with a temporary fever, a dry cough, and symptoms that are non-specific. And this is in healthy people. So they don't know that they've been exposed to histoplasmosis, and their bodies take care of it. In fact, in the Ohio Valley area, the majority of people will show that they've been exposed to histoplasma in their blood work. The antibodies are there, and it shows that they have some immunological history of being exposed. The real problem, though, for this disease is typically people who are not most, like in the healthy category, but people who are immunocompromised. So if a person is immunocompromised, I'll put a question mark here. If that's true, then this can lead to disseminated disease, which can be classified as systemic and possibly having multi-organ involvement. And people who require treatment due to a systemic infection that gets serious, and sometimes people are hospitalized, these individuals will likely receive a medication called amphotericin B, and there's another medication called ketoconazole. And so these two drugs have been some of the best known treatments as powerful medications that are hoped to stop this histoplasma infection before it would go further. Some people do die of disseminated histoplasmosis because it can be really severe, and the medications don't always work when you have a severely immunocompromised patient. This is the map that I was referring to that shows the distribution of histoplasma across the globe. So it's not just in Ohio Valley and the central and eastern part of the United States where all these blue dots are, but you can see incidences of histoplasma distributed through Central Africa and many countries there, and throughout different parts of South America and Central America, and even parts of Mexico, and the southern central part of the United States as well. And we can use this map as a way to refer back to the distribution of Blastomyces and Coccidioides as well, when referring to the other diseases that we'll learn about here. To continue on, though, about histoplasma for an extra slide or two, I would like you to just see the story in pictures. So here we can see some birds that are making a mess in the soil with their droppings, and then that will increase the nitrogen content, and on the microscopic level we can see what histoplasma looks like. These are what are called spores and hyphae, and surrounding each one of these little spores are tiny little dots called lipid droplets, and you can see these microscopically as it's part of a way to help identify what they look like. But when these become airborne during windy conditions or during construction or some disturbance in the soil, they can go into someone who's out exercising or working out in the environment, and then shortly thereafter, a few days later or weeks later, a person can end up with the signs and symptoms of what would seem to be a non-specific lung infection, but underneath it, what's going on at the cellular level is that alveolar macrophages called phagocytes in the air lungs can foster the growth of histoplasma yeasts that grow and multiply, and somehow they defeat the phagocyte's defenses. And so the way that the body defends against this is by producing scar in the lungs. The scar tissue will then wall off these organisms and keep a healthy person from serious infection. However, people who are not so healthy or fall into the immunocompromised category then can have virtually every major organ system in the body, which can be then invaded by histoplasma. And so disseminated histoplasmosis can bring about deadly consequences or severe effects that damage a person to the point where they may need serious intervention, and then the hope is just that they'll get past it before it totally destroys a person's systems. Speaking of serious infections, here's a picture on the right of someone who has HIV, and a serious case, looks like it could be life-threatening, where AIDS itself, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, is defined by the fact that the person is immunocompromised. And even though it's produced by a human immunodeficiency virus, the HIV virus isn't the ultimate cause of the death directly. In this case, this would be a person who is suffering from then the invasion of histoplasma, which all these little white areas throughout the lung chest x-ray are showing scarring and tissue damage in the lungs, whereas we look over here on the left, by comparison, a healthy normal set of lungs would have open air spaces that would not be marked by histoplasmosis scarring. A second and also serious type of systemic fungal infection by a true fungal pathogen is blastomycosis, caused by Blastomyces dermatitidis. And the species name dermatitidis, tells us something about the symptoms that can manifest in patients who get a serious infection with blastomycosis. It can actually cause skin nodules to form where the organism erupts from internally through the skin surface, and these yeast form of the organism can then be found in microscopic investigation of someone who's suffering from this. And the organism is dimorphic, so it's a mold out in the environment, and then most often it's inhaled into an unsuspecting person, and then these are just basically events that can happen anywhere where this organism is present. And it's been found in many soil samples in the Midwest and southeastern United States, so it's not here in California, just like we also are not at risk for histoplasmosis in California. And transmission is basically the same as what we see for histoplasmosis. So I'll write here, same as histoplasmosis, but with one exception. Histoplasmosis has been shown to be associated with soil that's enriched in bird droppings or high nitrogen content, but we have not seen, in the world of mycology, researchers have not seen the same association with blastomycosis. So, or the blastomycosis is not associated with the bird droppings. So it's a bit more mysterious as to why it pops up where it does. And the treatment seems to be the single drug amphotericin B. So in serious cases where people are hospitalized and or need treatment, this is the drug of choice. And we can see in yellow that the distribution geographically of blastomycosis is a little bit more limited and not seen in all areas of the world. Here are some pictures that tell the story of blastomycosis in images where, like this one on the left, in the upper left we see the hyphae, which are these thread stringy-like structures, and then we can see the mold spores that are growing from the hyphae, and these can be airborne after soil is disturbed, and Over here on the right, we can see a picture of a person suffering from a serious case of Blastomyces dermatitidis. The dermatitidis reminds us, the name reminds us of those eruptions that I was talking about in the skin. And this person also undoubtedly has other organ involvement, because a case this serious is going to be a systemic, deep problem in the body. And clinical samples will show, like this down here in the lower left, which reveals the yeasts that are at work from various organs in the body that have been infected. And we can see the symptoms start out as a cough and or fever. And then if a person has a real serious infection, then there can be cutaneous, skin involvement, bone involvement, and even central nervous system invasion. So in the worst of cases, people can die from this, but if the amphotericin B has an effect, it may be able to save a person from ultimate destruction. So very serious disease. The last of the systemic diseases that we'll discuss includes Coccidioidomycosis, also referred to as a valley fever. Instead of specifically Ohio valley fever, it's referred to as valley fever in general. And so we can think of places like right here in California, such as San Joaquin Valley. The cause of the disease is an organism called Coccidioides immitis, and immitis refers to the imitation that it has to mimic other diseases. And so many diseases can have a mild cough or a fever, and most people who suffer from a mild case of Coccidioides would have no idea that that's what they were suffering from. And we know that alkaline soils in the southwest of the United States, including California, can carry this particular mold in the soil, not necessarily associated with bird droppings like with histoplasmosis, but we find that the transmission is very much the same. So just like blastomycosis, we're going to say that valley fever is transmitted in the same way as histoplasmosis, but without specifying bird droppings as a factor. And the treatment is the same as well, which is amphotericin B. Here is a diagram showing Coccidioides transmission in pictures. And it starts out with a young kid shoveling some soil. And so number one, we can say that children seem to be more susceptible to Coccidioidomycosis than adults. And I'm not sure why. But as we see this kid digging, it's disturbing the soil, and then this produces airborne arthrospores, or simply just spores. They're called arthrospores because they're these little joints, which is what arthro is referring to. And these crack off and they become airborne. And then these arthrospores can then be inhaled into the lungs of an individual, who then will have germinating yeasts, and scar tissue can develop in there. And this is the body's effort to control this process, which is an invasion of the yeasts to form what are described as spherules or giant sporangia. And these can break open and spread to other parts of the lungs. And this is usually where the disease stops, but in immunocompromised individuals, the disease can disseminate and get into the bones and cause skin eruptions. They look different than the ones in blastomycosis, but it can also get into the central nervous system as well. And so the disease can be really serious or life-threatening in people who have a disseminated illness. Here's a picture of a 5.5-month-old, and you can see in the lungs here serious problems. All this white cloudiness is from scar tissue that's developing from an attack of Coccidioides. And so, as I was mentioning, young children tend to be more susceptible to Coccidioides infection. For the subcutaneous mycoses, we're only going to cover one disease for this, and that is called Sporotrichosis. Sporotrichosis, also commonly known as rose gardener's disease, is associated with rose thorns. They seem to be the perfect delivery vehicle for a prick underneath the skin surface, and this organism, Sporotrichosis, is a mold that can live on various types of vegetation, including roses. And the organism is also dimorphic, like the previous organisms that have been described. It can change forms from its mold form to growing as a yeast form underneath the skin's surface. And as common as it is, people who get this disease, it typically becomes a deep tissue infection. And in the worst cases, it can infect not only the appendages like feet, fingers, toes, legs, but also the lungs. And so in the worst cases, the lungs can become involved. And it can also be a lymphocutaneous infection because the lymphatic system, the lymph nodes, can swell up and become infected with these yeasts. And so the disease can range from having problems that are localized in the places where the tissue trauma occurred and the initial infection got set up, but then it can travel to nearby lymph nodes as well. So it potentially can be serious, but most cases of sporotrichosis remain localized to the site of infection or the areas surrounding the site of the infection. These pictures show the mold that causes sporotrichosis. So this microscopic picture here shows these little bean-shaped conidia, also just another name for the spores. You can see the little spores that pop up here growing off of the hyphae in this arrangement. And then when they get underneath the skin, like in this person's injury here, you can see some fairly bad-looking disease process going on. In some cases, something like this could require plastic surgery to repair the skin's appearance. And if you were to take samples from an infected person, whether it be this infection up here or even this really severe infection down here in a severely immunocompromised person, we'll see the yeasts. These are the yeast growths. You can see the mother cells and the little budding daughter cells that are coming off and growing and multiplying that lead to the tissue damage that you see here on the right. In this next section, we'll look at cutaneous mycoses. These are fungi that infect the skin. And they are sometimes referred to as dermatophytoses. And dermatophytoses include some of the more commonly known fungal infections like ringworm or athlete's foot, which is ringworm in the foot or toe area. And so these fungi infect the epidermis, including the skin, hair, and nails. And to date, there are almost 40 species, that 39 of which are in 3 different genuses or genera called Trichophyton, Microsporum, and Epidermophyton. And these infect humans and occasionally animals, and they all look very similar under the microscope and produce similar diseases where the skin will turn red and become irritated and start to flake and peel off, and it can be pretty painful to where the skin really feels like it's burning. And when it comes to ringworm, we need to dispel the myth right away that it has anything to do with worms whatsoever. Ringworm is just a description that someone came up with because they thought it looked like a worm underneath the skin that was growing, but it's actually a fungus. Here's a nice reference table taken from a different textbook than we're using currently, but it shows trichophyton, microsporum, and epidermophyton as causes of various ringworm, dermatophytose type fungal infections. How one of these pathogens is transmitted to you is from coming into contact with other humans, or perhaps from an infected animal that's carrying some of these pathogenic fungi, or maybe from the soil that's been in contact with infected humans or animals. And one of the most common sources are going to be continuously moist or wet environments like public showers, swimming pools, commonly shared items, maybe a towel, something like that, or shoes or flip-flops or who knows what. If those items have some common contact between more than one person or set of individuals, then these things can get passed around. And it's said that the skin has to have some sort of compromised nature to it. Maybe there's a little scratch or a crack, or as described here, chafed skin. And sometimes ringworm is passed between wrestlers or other athletes who are in full contact sports, football, etc. And what can happen is then the skin can experience some mild amount of trauma from rough force or impact, and then these fungi get transferred between individuals. And unfortunately, it can take a long time for these particular fungal infections to be resolved. They're slow growing, but they're also slow to heal, and it's mainly because it takes a lot of time to get rid of these fungi. They get underneath the skin and they start growing their hyphae type structures in the skin surface, and they irritate the skin, and they secrete toxins that cause inflammation, and then people have allergic reactions. And what happens is these foreign fungal proteins really start to cause the skin to become angry, and it's painful. There are many different types of dermatophytic infections in terms of just named after where they can affect the body. So there's skin all over the body surface, and you can have this on the scalp, and it has a technical medical term, Tinea capitis. Keep in mind, as much as Tinea capitis sounds like a genus and species, that's actually just medical terminology for the area of the body. Tinea means a fungal infection of the skin, and then capitis is referring to the head or the scalp. And then we have Tinea corporis for the body. There can be so-called Tinea cruris, which is basically commonly referred to as jock itch. You can have fingernails and toenails that can be infected. Fungus is really difficult to treat in these areas. The species of whatever's causing it will get underneath, and medications don't easily get under the fingernails or the toenails. And so we have this term here, Tinea unguium, that describes that. And then we can talk about ringworm of the foot, like we know commonly as athlete's foot, also known as Tinea pedis, more technically, or of the hand, Tinea manum. And here are some pictures just visually showing. In the upper left, you have your Tinea pedis, or athlete's foot. Tinea capitis, occurring here on this little boy's head in the top right. Tinea corporis down in the lower left. And then Tinea unguium. Those toenails, that's the other problem, is it's not always just one toenail, although it probably starts somewhere. The fungi can then move within a given environment if there's enough moisture, like inside of a shoe, and they can end up invading underneath multiple toenails. And so when it comes to treatment, these drugs that are listed here, tolmaftate, miconazole, sometimes it takes more than one round of application, minimum 2 to 3 weeks, applying these medications topically for a couple times a day, and trying to keep after this so that you inhibit the fungi. It does not necessarily eliminate them immediately. You can alleviate symptoms and you can see the symptoms start to fade, but then if these drugs are not applied for long enough, then if any amount of fungus remains, it can start to grow back and a person will relapse. And that's why in the most severe cases, sometimes Lamisil or a drug called griseofulvin can be taken as an internal drug as opposed to a topical application. And this is sometimes recommended for fingernail or toenail infections where it's hard to get the drug topically in, so then a person will take them through a pill that then, orally it'll build up in the systemic sense and battle the fungus from the inside out. In this next section, we'll look at superficial mycoses, and these are relegated beyond the living surfaces of the dermal or epidermal layers of tissue. So one such superficial mycosis is Tinea versicolor. Tinea meaning fungal infection of the skin, but in this case we're talking about the uppermost layer of skin, the epidermis where the dead tissue lays, and versicolor is referring to a variety of color or really an uneven coloring. So if we examine this picture on the slide a little more closely, we can see that the person has a medium color or tone to their skin, but then there are little spots that are whitish or lighter in color, and that is not uneven pigmentation. It's actually from the surface having growth of a fungal organism called Malassezia furfur. And the genus and species is a really unusual name, but it is the cause of what we call Tinea versicolor. And it's been discovered that many people have Malassezia furfur fungus as a normal flora, and that it's not always noticed. So lighter skinned people who have white skin or very pale skin, it's difficult to see the presence of Malassezia furfur. And it may not be that it's actually overgrown. And in darker skinned people where it's a little more noticeable, there's a contrast. And in the cases where Malassezia furfur has grown to visible numbers, we can then see this. And this does not typically cause significant harm to the person other than the change in appearance. Sometimes people will report that they can have irritated skin that might begin to flake and peel if this organism really starts to overgrow to a great degree. The relative moisture content of the person's skin can have a large influence on the overgrowth of the organism. So a lot of sweat, a lot of oil can sometimes then disproportionately affect people who are younger or more active or whose skin is damp and moist. And so climate and the place in which you live could have some amount of influence. So we see this disease distributed across the globe, but it's more problematic in tropical or very humid climates. Back on our last slide for just a moment, I forgot to mention that the Tinea versicolor is often treated with the same kind of antifungal drugs that the dermatophytes are treated with. So surface topical antifungals like miconazole or tinactin or Lamisil, and creams or even shampoo, like an anti-dandruff shampoo, sometimes will include these ingredients. And so, speaking of shampoo, there are actually people who require medicated shampoos to get rid of black and or white piedra. And piedra is the Spanish word for stone, like a small stone. And the white piedra is caused by something called Trichosporin baglii. Genus and species can sometimes invade hairs of all different types on the human body, and the fungi actually can start to invade into the hair shaft, and so they're hard to get rid of sometimes. And black piedra, which has an alternative name called Piedra hortae, is the same kind of effect, but you have fungi that have a dark brown or black gritty kind of appearance on the hair surface. Here are pictures of black and white Piedra close up, and in the case of the white Piedra here on the left, you can actually, if you look closely at it, you can see some of the hyphae of this fungus growing into the hair shaft, and so it's classified as endothrix. An endothrix infection is a technical term for invasion of the hair shaft. So it's very difficult to get rid of. Sometimes people end up wanting to cut that hair off because it just becomes next to impossible to get rid of it any other way. And on the left, we have a close-up picture of black Piedra. And black Piedra, you cannot see it from the photograph, but it's been studied to show that this organism does not invade the hair shaft and stays on the hair shaft's surface, and we call that ectothrix. Ecto meaning on or upon, on top of. So we'll put this this organism is relegated to the surface of the hair shaft. And just like with other mycoses, moisture control is important, and climate may even play a role depending on humidity and areas that people live, and the ability to wash and maintain hygiene to a level that would clear these organisms out more regularly. And they're known to be passed from unsanitary practices, like imagine going to a salon and if the scissors or cutting instruments were not sterilized, or I should say disinfected, using some solution like the blue stuff that you see in the barbershop. That's a quaternary ammonium ion compound. It's a disinfectant that kills both fungi and bacteria, and without proper cleaning or common contact items like trying on a hat at a hat store, and maybe other people have tried on that hat, you can imagine then that these fungi could get picked up and transferred through a common use item to another person. For our final group of fungal pathogens, we have the opportunistic mycoses, and they may be some of the most important of all. And that's because these affect people who are immunocompromised, whose body's given us a unique opportunity for the fungi to invade. And that's the common theme with a lot of fungal infections, especially severe ones, is we have to ask ourselves, if you're a healthcare professional, why would a person have a significantly severe fungal infection? And a lot of those fungal infections are what are called opportunists. There are 4 different organisms that are very important in the opportunistic category of fungal mycoses. We have Candida albicans, Cryptococcus neoformans, Pneumocystis carinii, and Aspergillus fumigatus. Looking first at Candida albicans, this is the genus and species that is the cause of the common yeast infection. Most of the time when people talk about a yeast infection, they're referring to Candida albicans or Candidiasis as the cause. Yeast infections can occur most commonly in the vaginal area, and it's estimated that up to 75% of women carry Candida albicans as normal flora in small numbers in the vaginal area, and most of the time it doesn't overgrow or cause a problem. But when a yeast infection occurs, it typically comes from following some sort of unbalancing event, like someone takes antibiotics, and antibiotics are meant to treat bacterial pathogens, so it eliminates the the pathogenic bacteria, but perhaps also the normal flora, the good guys that help to occupy and outcompete fungal organisms like Candida in these spaces. So then the vaginal area could experience an overgrowth, or also they can pop up in the oral cavity. And oral candidiasis is referred to as thrush. That's just another term for oral candidiasis. And in the worst cases of yeast infection, occasionally, like an infant, for instance, could get candidiasis that's severe, where it invades the skin, which is tender and not mature, or there can be moisture there that's higher than average, and so you can get someone who has cutaneous candidiasis, and the skin can look like it's been burned, like a diaper rash effect. And in the absolute most severe cases, this can lead to blood infection, whether the Candida comes in through an IV or some contaminated hospital setting or items. And if it gets into the blood, it's referred to as a systemic infection because it can get to all the systems of the body, and it can often involve then attack on multiple organs. And systemic candidiasis can become rapidly fatal. It's one of the top causes of death when a person dies due to what's called a hospital-acquired infection. So Candida has a lot of toxicity that comes along with it, where foreign fungal proteins can cause crisis from incredible amounts of inflammation in the person's system. And so we do have drugs like fluconazole that can treat Candida, and we hope that those always remain effective because candidiasis can be very common but also very serious in some cases. Oral candidiasis, as a special note, can also be one of the first signs of AIDS. So when people suffer from human immunodeficiency virus infection, HIV infection, this can lead to an immunocompromised situation, condition called AIDS, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. And when AIDS occurs due to death of part of the immune system called the T cells, then the oral cavity can start to develop thrush. And so it doesn't always occur as a rule, but when it does, it can be a common sign of the onset of AIDS. Next we have Cryptococcus neoformans. And Cryptococcus neoformans is a relatively uncommon disease-causing organism. The disease is called Cryptococcosis. And Cryptococcosis is a lung infection that leads to pneumonia. And it can be a fatal pneumonia, really severe fluid buildup in the lungs. And this fungal pathogen is a yeast that's encapsulated. And the capsule is what helps it to protect against phagocytic action. So in the lungs, there are the alveolar macrophages, which are lung phagocytes in the air sacs that should attack the yeast and eliminate it. But because the yeasts have these capsules, it allows them to escape this immune defense mechanism. And a person with a competent immune system who's perfectly healthy or close to it should be able to resist an infection with such an organism. But like Candida, people who are immunocompromised, who have AIDS or HIV, this can be one of the common causes of death as well. It has become known that cryptococcosis as a disease became much more prevalent during the 80s and 90s when AIDS and HIV became a pandemic problem. And while we're on that topic, one of the AIDS-defining illnesses, still to this day, but definitely in the time when AIDS was at its peak in the 80s and 90s, something called PCP pneumonia became a very common cause of death, where patients were discovered to be infected with a relatively rare type of fungus called Pneumocystis carinii. And so that's where the name comes from. P for pneumocystis, and then C for carinii, and then P for pneumonia. And strangely, Pneumocystis carinii has been renamed to Pneumocystis girovecii. I don't know why it was renamed. The renaming of its species is not something that I know the story behind, but if you see P. girovecii or P. carinii, it's referring to the same organism. And PCP pneumonia was extremely uncommon before AIDS and HIV. Another strange fact about Pneumocystis carinii is that the organism has characteristics that seem to be fungal, but also partially protozoan, which makes very little sense when you think about it, but researchers were confused for a very long time because Pneumocystis carinii exhibited properties of both protozoan characteristics as well as fungi, but ultimately it was genetically analyzed and found to be a fungus. And finally, of all the fungi on this page, let's end with Aspergillus fumigatus. Aspergillus fumigatus is a cause of one of the most severe forms of what's called aspergillosis. And aspergillosis occurs initially, usually from inhalation of fungal spores from the environment, from Aspergillus, and they get into the lungs and they cause a type of fungal pneumonia. That fungal pneumonia, well, these are all fungi, so this aspergillosis starts out in the lungs, and occasionally, especially the species fumigatus, can invade beyond the lungs, and if the person doesn't die of pneumonia itself, it can spread to other organs of the body and become a systemic illness in the worst of cases. And there's another species of aspergillosis besides fumigatus called Aspergillus niger, and the same story can occur. Fumigatus seems to be more virulent and more severe when it does pop up, but it's less common than Aspergillus niger, which is just spread throughout the environment. But when either of these Aspergillus species causes lung disease, and especially if it spreads beyond the lungs in immunocompromised patients, or really people don't get these diseases very often at all if they don't have some sort of underlying immunocompromised status, then they can be really bad when they take a hold. Very difficult to treat as well. Here are a few more facts about Candida. Just that it's widespread, it's everywhere, it's part of people's normal flora a good portion of the time, more than half the time. And so, as I mentioned in the previous slide, 75% of women carry it or may even experience it as an outbreak, a yeast infection, at least once in their lives. And the infection can range from just a minor irritation, something that requires temporary treatment, to something that's just absolutely devastating or deadly. And not only is candidiasis found as normal flora, but it can also be found in the intestines and on the skin, depending on the moisture content. Certain areas of the body where there's a lot of moisture, where there's a lot of skin-to-skin contact. They're called intraginal areas. So your armpits, your groin, etc. Candidiasis is known to be extremely concerning in the hospital setting. Nosocomial refers to what we call hospital acquired. So if you hear that term, nosocomial, a nosocomial infection, it means hospital acquired. It means that someone's in the hospital receiving treatment for whatever their condition is, and then they end up picking up something else. And hospital acquired has become a more accepted term these days than to use the term nosocomial. So you may hear hospital acquired abbreviated as HA, and this is because insurance companies really like this term hospital acquired, and they prefer that more than nosocomial. And this is because nosocomial is a technical term that doesn't always imply that it's the hospital's responsibility. But, oh, I spelled acquired wrong. Hospital acquired, the name then lets us know where that infection came from. And so this, staph infection would be another extremely common hospital-acquired infection, probably the #1 most common. But candidiasis is fungal, and that's unique. Here are just a few facts listed out, just really trying to detail out some of what candidiasis involves. So it's reiterating what I had said verbally in my first slide about Candida. And here's some pictures just to make it that much more real for you. You can see how it can be pretty painful, whether it's the oral thrush cases you see here or the burns on that baby skin. And this is our final slide for our presentation on fungi. And it's just a reference of these opportunistic pathogens, and look at what they are associated with. Here's the final take-home point for today. And if there's even just one slide that you should remember as a common theme throughout this entire presentation, it's this right here. Every one of these items here they spell out immunocompromised or underlying conditions in the patients who experience fungal infections for the most part that we see. So people on antibiotic therapy, catheters, diabetes, use of corticosteroids and immunosuppressants, people with cancer like leukemia, underlying conditions like tuberculosis, which is a lung infection that really knocks a person down and can be life-threatening on its own, IV drug abusers. There are just so many different people that fall into this category. Burn victims would be another one. And they are all people whose immune systems have taken a giant hit because their bodies have been traumatized or have severe underlying conditions. And then the fungi can take advantage opportunistically in a much different way than when compared to healthy individuals who are not in these categories. And so always try to remember that these people fall into this immunocompromised category, and then fungal infections are a greater risk. All right, that's it, guys. Hope you understand fungi a whole lot more now, and that you always remember that not everything is bacterial or fungal when it comes to infections out there, and we can't forget about the fungi.